Joseph Whitehorse dropped his coffee mug, the ceramic shattering against the porch boards as thunder's desperate bellow cut through the pre-dawn darkness like a funeral cry. The 1,200-pound Brahman bull stood rigid beside the ancient Cherokee oak, his massive frame trembling against the storm's fury at exactly 3:17 a.m., the precise moment Martha had drawn her last breath 3 years ago. This wasn't normal animal behavior. This was a message from the grave. Margaret Rose stumbled from her house next door, her bathrobe soaked within seconds, screaming over the thunder, "Joe! The tree's been split open!" Lightning had torn through the oak's bulging trunk like God's own scalpel, revealing something metallic, gleaming in the wound, something that had been waiting 2 centuries to be found. Joseph's weathered hands shook as he touched the copper surface, remembering Martha's final whispered words about secrets buried in sacred ground. Thunder had been guarding this spot every night since the funeral, refusing food, refusing comfort, refusing to abandon his post. "Dear Lord, what were you trying to tell me, sweetheart?" The metal felt warm despite the October chill, pulsing like a heartbeat beneath his palm. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching. From now, let's continue with the story. Joseph Whitehorse had never imagined that at 72 years old, he'd be standing in his pajamas at dawn, staring at what might be the answer to prayers he'd been too proud to voice. The retired elementary school teacher had spent 30 years shaping young minds in Cherokee County, North Carolina, but nothing in those decades of patience and wisdom had prepared him for the moment his 1,000-pound Brahman bull would become his guide to Martha's final message. The farm stretched across 80 acres of rolling Appalachian foothills, land that had belonged to the Whitehorse family since his Cherokee ancestors first settled here in the 1820s. The old farmhouse, with its sagging front porch and peeling white paint, had witnessed 4 generations of births, deaths, and everything in between. But it was the ancient oak tree that held the real power on this land, a massive sentinel that the Cherokee had considered sacred long before any European had set foot in these mountains. Joseph's weathered hands, scarred from decades of farm work and gentle from years of guiding children's pencils, trembled as he reached toward the metallic object embedded in the oak's split trunk. His silver hair, still thick despite his age, was plastered to his skull by the rain, and his blue flannel pajamas clung to his lean frame. The deep lines around his eyes, carved by years of laughter in the classroom and tears in the cancer ward, deepened as he squinted through the storm. Thunder stood beside him like a 4-legged mountain, his coat so dark it seemed to absorb the lightning's brief illumination. The bull's reddish-brown patches caught the sporadic flashes, making him appear to glow from within. At 6 years old, Thunder was in his prime, but lately he'd been acting like an old soul carrying the weight of generations. Ever since Martha's funeral, the bull had refused to graze in the far pastures, instead maintaining a constant vigil by the oak tree that had been Martha's favorite meditation spot during her battle with cancer. Margaret Rose Chen hurried across the muddy ground between their properties, her small frame dwarfed by Joseph's height, but her presence filling the space with determined energy. At 65, the Chinese-American widow had survived the loss of her soldier son 30 years ago and her husband 5 years past, emerging from each tragedy with a fiercer commitment to protecting the family she'd chosen. Her graying black hair hung in wet strands around her angular face, and her dark eyes blazed with the intensity of someone who'd learned that life was too precious to waste on hesitation. "Joe, honey, that tree's been trying to tell us something for months," she called out, her southern accent touched with the careful pronunciation she'd learned as a young immigrant. "Thunder hasn't been acting crazy. He's been acting like a dog waiting for his master to come home from war. That bull knows something we don't." The morning after the storm brought a silence that felt like death itself had settled over Willowbrook Farm. Joseph sat at his kitchen table, staring at the foreclosure notice that had arrived 3 days earlier, the numbers swimming before his tired eyes like accusatory ghosts. $180,000. The sum might as well have been $1 million for all the hope he had of raising it in 30 days. He traced the breakdown with a shaking finger. $85,000 for Martha's cancer treatments that insurance hadn't covered, $30,000 in back taxes from the years when he'd been too focused on her dying to pay attention to paperwork, and $65,000 for the new barn roof and equipment repairs after last spring's tornado had torn through their property like God's own wrecking ball. His teacher's pension provided $1,800 a month, barely enough to keep the lights on, and thunder fed. Thunder. Joseph's gaze drifted through the rain-streaked window toward the oak tree where his bull maintained his strange vigil. The massive Brahmin hadn't eaten properly in 2 days, hadn't moved more than a few yards from the split trunk, and had started making low, mournful sounds that reminded Joseph too much of the way Martha had hummed during her final weeks, like someone trying to comfort themselves through unbearable pain. The sound of Margaret Rose's screen door slamming cut through his melancholy. She appeared on his porch moments later, her weathered hands clutching something white against her chest. "Joe, you need to see this," she called through the glass, her voice carrying an urgency that made his heart skip. He opened the door to find her holding a piece of paper, her dark eyes wide with something between wonder and fear. "I found this tied to Thunder's collar with a piece of Martha's hair ribbon," she said, her words tumbling over each other. "It's in her handwriting, Joe." Dated 3 years ago tomorrow, the day before she passed. Joseph's hands trembled as he took the note. Martha's careful script, weakened by illness but still distinctly hers, filled half the page. "When the tree bleeds metal, follow thunder to my heart. The treasure that matters most was never gold, my love, but the love that never dies. Trust him as you trusted me. Forever yours, M." The paper crackled in his grip as something deep in his chest broke open. "She knew," he whispered. Somehow, she knew this day would come. Margaret Rose stepped closer, her small hand finding his shoulder. "Joe, honey, I need to tell you something else. Martha asked me to do something before she died, but she made me promise to wait until you were ready to hear it." She paused, studying his face with the careful attention of someone who'd learned to read grief like a second language. "She hid things, Joe. Notes, letters, little messages all over this property. She said when Thunder started acting strange by that old oak, I was supposed to help you find them." The revelation hit him like cold water. All those afternoons when Martha had insisted on walking the property alone during her chemo treatments, claiming the fresh air helped her think clearly, she'd been preparing for this moment, planning for a future she wouldn't see, leaving breadcrumbs for him to follow when he was lost in the wilderness of her absence. Outside, Thunder's bellowing grew more insistent, a sound that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards of the old farmhouse. Joseph looked toward the tree and saw something that made his breath catch. The bull was pawing at the base of the oak with his massive hooves, digging in the soft earth that the storm had loosened. Each time his hoof struck the ground, the metallic object in the tree's wound seemed to catch the pale morning light, winking like a star trying to signal across impossible distances. "Lord have mercy," Margaret Rose breathed, following his gaze. "Look at him, Joe. That bull's trying to dig something up." Joseph felt the weight of 30 years of marriage settling on his shoulders like a familiar coat. Martha had always been the planner, the one who thought 3 steps ahead while he lived comfortably in the present. She'd balanced their checkbook, remembered their anniversary, and somehow always known when he needed exactly the right words to heal a bad day. Even dying, she'd been planning ahead, preparing for the moment when he'd need her guidance most desperately. The foreclosure notice crinkled in his other hand, a harsh reminder that divine messages didn't pay earthly debts. But as he watched Thunder's determined excavation, as he felt Martha's final note warming between his fingers, Joseph Whitehorse began to understand that some treasures couldn't be measured in dollars and cents. Some treasures could only be measured in the depth of love that survived even death itself. The stranger arrived on Joseph's doorstep like a bad omen wrapped in a $1,000 suit. Richard Blackwood stepped out of his gleaming black SUV with the confidence of a man who'd never been told no in his 45 years, his silver hair perfectly styled despite the humid October morning. His smile was all teeth and no warmth as he extended a manicured hand toward Joseph, who stood on his sagging porch in work boots and yesterday's flannel shirt. "Mr. Whitehorse, I'm Rick Blackwood with Cherokee Valley Resort Corporation," he said, his voice carrying the smooth cadence of someone accustomed to closing deals over expensive dinners. "I heard about your recent financial difficulties, and I believe I have a solution that could benefit us both." Joseph's weathered hands remained at his sides, his teacher's instincts recognizing the predatory gleam behind Rick's polished exterior. 30 years of dealing with pushy parents and slick administrators had taught him to read people like open books, and this particular book was written in dollar signs and fine print. "I'm not interested in selling, Mr. Blackwood." Rick's smile never wavered, but something cold flickered behind his gray eyes. "Please call me Rick, and I think you'll find my offer quite generous. $300,000 for your 80 acres. That's nearly double the assessed value, more than enough to cover your debts and set you up comfortably in town. At your age, wouldn't a nice condo be easier to maintain than all this land?" The condescension in that last sentence hit Joseph like a slap. At your age? As if 72 made him a doddering fool, incapable of making his own decisions. He straightened to his full 6-foot height, his blue eyes flashing with the same fire that had once made unruly sixth-graders sit up and pay attention. "This land has been in my family for 200 years, son. I'm not about to be the one who breaks that chain. I understand the sentimental attachment," Rick continued, pulling a folder from his leather briefcase with practiced efficiency, "but sentiment doesn't pay medical bills or keep the bank from foreclosing. My company specializes in preserving Cherokee heritage while making these beautiful mountains accessible to visitors who appreciate their cultural significance. We'd build tasteful resort facilities, maybe a museum, certainly a memorial to your wife. I heard she was quite beloved in the community." The mention of Martha made Joseph's jaw clench. This vulture had done his homework, researched the weak spots where he could apply pressure. But before Joseph could respond, Thunder's bellow echoed across the property, followed by the sound of splintering wood. Both men turned toward the oak tree, where the massive bull was pawing at the ground with increasing agitation, his dark eyes fixed on Rick with unmistakable hostility. Margaret Rose appeared from behind the farmhouse, her arms full of freshly gathered eggs and her expression thunderous. "Well, well, what do we have here? Another city slicker come to steal land from folks who can't afford fancy lawyers?" She set the egg basket down with deliberate care, her small frame somehow managing to project menace as she approached the porch. "I've seen your kind before, mister. All polish and promises until the ink's dry. Then it's so sorry. Change of plans." Rick's composure slipped slightly as he found himself outnumbered by 2 elderly mountain folks and one very large, very angry bull. "Ma'am, I assure you our intentions are entirely honorable. We're offering Mr. Whitehorse financial security and the chance to preserve his family's legacy in a way that benefits the entire community." "And the resort would bring jobs, tourism, revenue?" "Horse shit," Margaret Rose cut him off, her southern accent sharp as broken glass. "You want to turn sacred Cherokee land into some Disney version of mountain culture. Build a bunch of fake log cabins for rich folks to pretend they're roughing it while they sip overpriced coffee and complain about the Wi-Fi." Thunder's agitation was growing more pronounced, his massive hooves leaving deep gouges in the earth around the oak tree. The bull kept looking between the metallic object gleaming in the tree's wound and Rick's presence, as if connecting the two as threats to his territory. Joseph had never seen his gentle giant behave so aggressively toward a human being. "Your bull seems upset," Rick observed, taking an involuntary step backward as Thunder snorted and pawed the ground. "Perhaps we should continue this conversation somewhere more private." "Thunder's got excellent judgment when it comes to character," Joseph replied, his voice carrying the quiet authority of 3 decades in the classroom. "He's been acting protective of that old oak tree lately, and I've learned to trust his instincts." Rick's eyes sharpened with interest as he followed Joseph's gaze to the split trunk. "That's quite an unusual formation in the wood. Almost looks like there's something metallic embedded in there. Local legend, perhaps. The kind of thing that might attract tourists interested in Cherokee folklore?" The naked greed in Rick's voice made Joseph's stomach turn. This wasn't about preserving heritage or helping the community. This was about exploiting whatever secret the oak tree held, turning Martha's final message into a roadside attraction for profit. The realization settled over him like ice water, clarifying his thoughts in a way that all of Rick's smooth talk hadn't managed to cloud. "I think you should leave now," Joseph said quietly, his teacher's voice carrying the absolute finality that had once sent misbehaving students scurrying for their seats. "This property isn't for sale, not to you or anyone like you." Rick's mask slipped completely, revealing the cold calculation beneath his polished exterior. "You have 26 days before foreclosure, Mr. Whitehorse. My offer stands until then, but it won't get better with time. Think carefully about what's more important, stubborn pride or practical survival." As Rick's SUV disappeared down the gravel drive, Joseph felt the weight of the decision settling on his shoulders like a lead blanket. Thunder's bellowing had subsided to worried rumbles, but the bull remained positioned protectively between the oak tree and the spot where Rick had stood, as if he understood exactly what kind of threat they were facing. The days following Rick Blackwood's visit passed like a slow-motion avalanche, each hour bringing Joseph closer to losing everything he'd held sacred. 23 days remained until foreclosure, and the weight of that countdown pressed against his chest like a stone every time he drew breath. He'd started selling Martha's belongings, first her jewelry, then her sewing machine, finally the antique hope chest her grandmother had brought from Ireland. Each sale felt like cutting away another piece of his heart, but the small amounts barely made a dent in the massive debt. Margaret Rose had mortgaged her own modest home without telling him, presenting him with a check for $35,000 on a gray Tuesday morning when the October chill had settled into his bones like arthritis. "Don't you dare try to refuse this," she'd said, her dark eyes blazing with the fierce protectiveness of someone who'd already lost too much family to let pride claim another casualty. "Danny would have wanted his college fund to help save this place. That boy loved playing in these fields before the war took him from me." Thunder's behavior had grown increasingly erratic as the financial pressure mounted. The great bull spent his days pacing between the oak tree and the farmhouse, occasionally bringing objects to the split trunk like offerings at an altar. Joseph had found Martha's gardening gloves placed carefully at the tree's base, followed by old photographs that had somehow blown from the porch. And once, mysteriously, Martha's wedding ring, which Joseph was certain he'd sold to the jeweler in town 3 days earlier. The discovery of the ring had shaken him more than he cared to admit. Either his memory was failing worse than he'd feared, or Thunder possessed an intelligence that bordered on the supernatural. The bull seemed to understand not just the emotional weight of the objects he gathered, but their specific significance to Joseph's relationship with Martha. It was as if Thunder was trying to reconstruct their life together, piece by precious piece, around the base of the oak tree that held her final secret. Word of the strange happenings at Willowbrook Farm had spread through Cherokee County like wildfire through dry grass. The local newspaper, hungry for any story more interesting than high school football scores and county commissioner meetings, had sent a young reporter named Billy Crow Feather to investigate. Billy was Cherokee himself, fresh out of journalism school and eager to write about something that might actually matter to his people. "Mr. Whitehorse," Billy had said, his notebook ready and his digital recorder held between them like a peace offering, "the Tribal Council is very interested in what you might find in that old oak. Elder Sarah Walking Bear says that tree was already ancient when her great-grandmother was young. If there's something Cherokee hidden inside, it belongs to all of us." The interview had brought unexpected consequences. By the weekend, a steady stream of visitors had begun arriving at the farm. Some curious locals, others Cherokee tribe members, who spoke in hushed, reverent tones about sacred trees and ancestral messages. A few brought offerings of their own, sage bundles, small stones, tobacco ties left respectfully at the tree's base. Thunder seemed to approve of these visitors, allowing them to approach while remaining vigilant against anyone who felt wrong to his mysterious instincts. But the attention also drew less welcome interest. Rick Blackwood had returned twice, each time with different colleagues, lawyers, surveyors, and once a man who claimed to be an expert in Cherokee antiquities, but whose questions focused more on monetary value than cultural significance. Thunder had chased the antiquities expert back to his rental car, and the man had threatened to call animal control until Margaret Rose reminded him that he was trespassing on private property with a bull that was simply protecting his home. Joseph's former students had started arriving too, now adults with children of their own, drawn by social media posts and small-town gossip networks. They came bearing casseroles and memories, sharing stories of how Mr. Joe had believed in them when no one else would, how he'd stayed after school to help with reading, how he'd shown up at their high school graduations even years after they'd left his sixth-grade classroom. Their presence warmed Joseph's heart, but also deepened his shame at the thought of losing the farm that had been such an integral part of their shared history. Sarah Walking Bear, the tribal elder Billy had mentioned, arrived on a crisp Thursday morning in her grandson's pickup truck, her silver braids adorned with small bells that chimed softly as she moved. At 84, she commanded respect through sheer presence, her dark eyes holding the accumulated wisdom of nearly 9 decades. Thunder, who had been aggressive toward most strangers, immediately calmed in her presence, allowing her to approach the oak tree and place her weathered palm against its wounded bark. "This tree remembers when my people walked freely in these mountains," she said, her voice carrying the musical cadence of Cherokee mixed with English. "My great-grandmother used to say that some trees are doorways between the world of the living and the world of spirits. When lightning opens such a door, it's because someone on the other side has something important to say." Sarah's presence had legitimized the mystery in a way that newspaper articles couldn't. She brought with her the authority of traditional knowledge, the kind passed down through generations of storytellers and keepers of memory. More importantly, she brought a different perspective on ownership itself. The Cherokee people never believed in owning land the way white folks do, she explained to Joseph as they sat on his porch, watching Thunder methodically arrange fallen leaves around the oak's base. "We were caretakers, guardians. The land owned us as much as we belonged to it. If your family has been caring for this particular piece of earth for 2 centuries, then you're Cherokee in your heart, regardless of the blood in your veins." Her words stirred something deep in Joseph's chest, a recognition that went beyond cultural boundaries. He had always felt like a caretaker rather than an owner, responsible for maintaining something larger than himself. The realization brought both comfort and additional pressure. If he lost the farm, he wouldn't just be failing himself or Martha's memory, but betraying a trust that stretched back through generations. The financial countdown continued its relentless march. 18 days, 15, 12. Joseph had sold everything of value except Martha's wedding dress, which hung in their bedroom closet like a ghost made of silk and lace. He couldn't bring himself to part with it, though he knew it might fetch enough to buy another week or two. Every morning brought new bills, new reminders of debts that seemed to multiply like weeds in an untended garden. Rick Blackwood's offers had evolved, becoming more creative and more insidious. He'd started approaching Joseph's neighbors, offering to buy their properties as well, painting a picture of a comprehensive development that would bring prosperity to the entire valley. Some were tempted. Farming was hard work with uncertain rewards, and the promise of financial security appealed to aging couples facing their own mortality and medical expenses. Margaret Rose had become Joseph's unofficial bodyguard, intercepting visitors and screening phone calls with the efficiency of a seasoned secretary. She'd moved her morning coffee routine to Joseph's porch, positioning herself as a buffer between him and the outside world's demands. Her presence was a comfort, but it also reminded him daily of how much his crisis was affecting the people who loved him. Thunder's vigil had evolved into something resembling a ritual. Each morning at dawn, the bull would position himself directly between the oak tree and the farmhouse, facing outward like a sentinel. He'd remain there until evening, occasionally moving to investigate sounds or smells, but always returning to his post. The metallic object in the tree seemed to fascinate him particularly during certain times of day, dawn, noon, and dusk, when the changing light made it gleam like a beacon. Joseph had begun to wonder if Martha had somehow trained Thunder for this moment, prepared him to be more than just a companion animal, but an actual guardian of whatever secret lay hidden in the oak's heart. The bull's behavior was too purposeful, too consistent to be random animal instinct. Every action seemed calculated to protect and preserve something precious until the right moment for revelation arrived. The community response had surprised him. Cherokee County wasn't wealthy, and its residents knew the value of a dollar earned through hard work. Yet donations had begun arriving, small amounts from people who remembered Joseph's years of service in the classroom, larger contributions from former students who'd found success in distant cities. The Cherokee Nation itself had established a fund to help preserve what they were calling culturally significant properties, with Joseph's farm as the first beneficiary. But even with the community's support, the mathematics remained brutal. They'd raised perhaps $60,000, a significant sum that represented countless sacrifices from good-hearted people, but still far short of what the bank demanded. Joseph lay awake at night, calculating and recalculating, searching for mathematical miracles that didn't exist outside of children's fairy tales. 7 days remained when Thunder's behavior changed again. Instead of his usual dawn-to-dusk vigil, the bull began making pilgrimages around the property, visiting specific locations with what appeared to be deliberate intent. He'd stand at the spot where Martha's garden had flourished, then move to the old well house, then to the corner of the pasture where she'd like to watch sunsets. At each location, he'd lower his massive head as if searching for something, then move on to the next predetermined stop. "He's following a map," Margaret Rose observed, watching from the kitchen window as Thunder completed another circuit. "Question is, who drew it?" The decision to extract the mysterious object from the oak tree came not from desperation, though Joseph felt plenty of that with 5 days remaining until foreclosure, but from Thunder's increasingly urgent behavior. The massive bull had stopped eating entirely, his ribs beginning to show through his dark coat as he maintained his vigil with the single-minded devotion of a monk approaching enlightenment. Dr. Sarah Mankiller, the Cherokee veterinarian who'd been treating Thunder since he was a calf, delivered her diagnosis with the gentle firmness of someone accustomed to delivering difficult truths. "His heart's under tremendous stress, Joseph," she said. her stethoscope still draped around her neck after examining the bull. Whatever's driving this behavior, it's literally killing him. Bulls aren't built for this kind of sustained emotional intensity. If something doesn't change soon, you're going to lose him. The thought of losing Thunder on top of everything else was more than Joseph could bear. Martha's death had nearly broken him. The prospect of foreclosure was eating away at his spirit like acid, but the idea of watching his faithful companion waste away from some inexplicable grief was simply unbearable. Thunder had been Martha's gift to him during her final Christmas, a gangly calf she'd insisted would grow into exactly the friend Joseph would need when she was gone. Her prescience had proven heartbreakingly accurate. Margaret Rose had made the phone calls while Joseph sat beside Thunder in the pasture, his weathered hand resting on the bull's massive neck. She'd contacted Dr. Amanda Crow Feather, a tree surgeon who specialized in historic preservation, explaining the situation with the careful diplomacy of someone who understood that city professionals might be skeptical of rural mysteries. Amanda had driven up from Asheville within hours, her truck loaded with equipment that looked more suited to a hospital than a farm. "I've worked on trees that were standing when George Washington was born," Amanda said, running her hands over the oak's wounded bark with the reverence of a surgeon examining a patient. "But I've never seen anything quite like this. The way the wood has grown around this object suggests it was placed here deliberately, probably when the tree was much younger. Someone wanted this hidden, but they also wanted it preserved." The Cherokee Tribal Council had insisted on witnessing the extraction, sending Sarah Walking Bear along with 2 younger men who served as cultural preservationists. Their presence lent gravity to the proceedings, transforming what might have been a simple tree surgery into something approaching a ceremony. Sarah had brought sage to burn, its smoke drifting across the property like incense, while the younger men drummed softly on traditional Cherokee drums. Rick Blackwood had somehow learned about the planned extraction, arriving with a court order he claimed gave him the right to observe any archaeological discoveries on property his company intended to purchase. The document looked official enough to worry Joseph, though Amanda pointed out that it had no legal standing until the foreclosure was actually complete. Still, Rick positioned himself at the edge of the gathering with the patient intensity of a vulture waiting for death. Thunder's reaction to the preparation was immediate and dramatic. As Amanda unpacked her surgical saws and preservation equipment, the bull moved closer to the oak tree, positioning himself between the trunk and the assembled crowd. His eyes, usually gentle despite his massive size, took on a fierce protectiveness that made even the tribal council members step back respectfully. Only Joseph seemed able to approach without triggering the bull's defensive instincts. "Easy, boy," Joseph whispered, his hand finding the familiar comfort of Thunder's warm flank. "Martha sent you to guard this, didn't she? But now it's time to let her speak. Whatever she hid in this old tree, she meant for us to find it." The extraction process required the delicate precision of a heart surgeon combined with the patience of an archaeologist. Amanda began with handheld tools, carefully removing layers of bark and sapwood that had grown around the mysterious object over decades. Each cut revealed more of what appeared to be a copper cylinder, its surface green with patina, but still structurally sound. Thunder watched every movement with the intensity of a medical student observing his first operation. As more of the cylinder became visible, details emerged that made the assembled crowd murmur with amazement. Cherokee symbols had been etched into the metal alongside English script, and what appeared to be a wax seal held the container closed. The craftsmanship was exquisite, clearly the work of someone who understood that this object needed to survive for generations. "Whoever made this knew what they were doing," Amanda observed, her voice hushed with professional respect. "This isn't some amateur's treasure hunt. This was created by someone who understood metallurgy, wood growth patterns, and long-term preservation. They meant for this to last centuries." Rick Blackwood had grown increasingly agitated as the extraction proceeded, his earlier confidence replaced by barely contained anxiety. He kept checking his phone and muttering into it, clearly communicating with people Joseph couldn't see. The developer's nervous energy seemed to affect Thunder, who began snorting and pawing the ground whenever Rick moved closer to the tree. Sarah Walking Bear approached the partially extracted cylinder with the slow deliberation of someone reading ancient text. Her weathered fingers hovered just above the Cherokee symbols, not quite touching but close enough to feel whatever power they might contain. "These marks," she said softly, "they're not just decorative. They're protective symbols, meant to keep sacred things safe from those who would misuse them." The final extraction required the combined efforts of Amanda and her assistant, a Cherokee man named Robert Ridge, who worked for the National Forest Service. They used pulleys and soft straps to ease the cylinder from its wooden prison, taking nearly an hour to complete the process without damaging either the tree or its precious cargo. Thunder remained motionless throughout, as if understanding that this moment required absolute stillness. When the cylinder finally came free, it felt surprisingly heavy in Joseph's hands, dense with more than just metal and whatever contents it held. The weight of history, of Martha's final message, of 2 centuries of secrets, all of it seemed concentrated in the foot-long container that was warm to the touch despite the October chill. The Cherokee symbols seemed to shimmer in the afternoon light, and Joseph found himself thinking of Martha's fascination with Native American culture. She'd spent hours reading about Cherokee history, had learned basic words in the language, and had always insisted that the land chose its caretakers rather than the other way around. Looking at the cylinder in his hands, he began to understand that her final message might be larger than just their personal love story. Rick Blackwood made his move as the crowd began to disperse, approaching Joseph with a contract already prepared and a pen extended like a weapon. "Mr. Whitehorse, that artifact was discovered on property that will legally belong to my company in 5 days. I'm prepared to offer you an additional $50,000 above our original purchase price, plus a percentage of any profits from historical tourism that cylinder might generate." Thunder's response was immediate and terrifying. The massive bull charged toward Rick with a speed that seemed impossible for an animal of his size, stopping just short of trampling the developer, but close enough that Rick's expensive suit was splattered with mud from the bull's hooves. The message was clear. This was Thunder's territory, and Rick was not welcome. "I think you should leave," Joseph said quietly, the cylinder cradled against his chest like a newborn child. "This isn't about money, Mr. Blackwood." It never was. As Rick's SUV disappeared down the gravel drive, trailing dust and wounded pride, Joseph found himself surrounded by people who understood the weight of the moment. Sarah Walking Bear placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. Margaret Rose stood fierce and protective at his side, and Thunder positioned himself like a living shield between the cylinder and any future threats. The real question now was what Martha's final message would reveal, and whether it could possibly contain the miracle needed to save everything Joseph held dear. In his hands, the ancient copper felt warm as a beating heart, as if whatever waited inside was still very much alive. The night Thunder collapsed marked the beginning of Joseph's darkest hour. It happened without warning as the great bull stood his eternal vigil beside the oak tree, his massive frame simply folding inward like a building losing its foundation. One moment he was the steadfast guardian who'd protected Martha's secret for 3 years, the next he was a mountain of suffering flesh, his labored breathing the only sound cutting through the October darkness. Dr. Sarah Mankiller arrived within 20 minutes of Margaret Rose's frantic phone call, her headlights cutting through the gloom as she navigated the rutted farm road with practiced ease. She knelt beside Thunder in the damp grass, her stethoscope moving across his heaving flanks, while Joseph held the bull's massive head in his lap, stroking the familiar pattern of black and reddish-brown hair that had comforted him through 3 years of widowhood. "His heart's giving out," Sarah said quietly, her Cherokee features grave in the flashlight's harsh glare. "All that stress, all that emotional intensity, his body can't sustain it anymore. I can give him something for the pain, but Joseph—" She paused, her dark eyes meeting his with the terrible compassion of someone who'd delivered this news too many times. "He's got maybe 24 hours. I'm sorry." The words hit Joseph like a physical blow, driving the air from his lungs and leaving him gasping in the cold night air. Thunder, who had been Martha's final gift to him, who had somehow understood her dying instructions and carried them faithfully for 3 years, was slipping away just when his mission was finally complete. The cosmic unfairness of it felt like being struck by lightning twice in the same spot. Margaret Rose knelt beside them, her small hands joining Joseph's in comforting the dying bull. "Oh, honey," she whispered, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. You've been such a good boy, such a faithful friend. You did everything Martha asked of you, didn't you?" Thunder's eyes, usually bright with intelligence and mischief, had grown dim with approaching death. But when Joseph leaned close to his ear, the bull's gaze sharpened momentarily, as if summoning his remaining strength for one final moment of connection. Joseph felt the weight of the copper cylinder in his jacket pocket, still unopened, still holding whatever message Martha had entrusted to this magnificent creature's protection. "I know, boy," Joseph whispered, his voice breaking like a dam under pressure. "You want me to read her letter, don't you? You've been waiting so long for this moment." As if understanding every word, Thunder let out a soft, rumbling sound, not the bellowing cry that had become his signature over the past weeks, but something gentler, more resigned. It was the sound of a job well done, of a duty faithfully discharged despite the personal cost. Joseph had heard similar sounds in his classroom over the years, from children who'd finally mastered a difficult lesson or completed a challenging project. The veterinarian administered pain medication and left them with instructions for making Thunder's final hours as comfortable as possible. Margaret Rose brought blankets from the house, thick quilts that Martha had sewn during her final winter, and they arranged them around the bull's massive form like a nest of memories and love. Joseph found himself unable to leave Thunder's side, even as the October night grew colder and his arthritis began protesting the damp ground. This bull had been his constant companion through the loneliest period of his life, the living bridge between his marriage and his widowhood. Thunder had somehow known when Joseph needed silent company, when he needed distraction, and when he needed the simple comfort of another living creature who had also loved Martha. As dawn approached, painting the eastern mountains in shades of pink and gold, Joseph finally worked up the courage to examine Martha's cylinder. His fingers trembled as he traced the Cherokee symbols that Sarah Walking Bear had identified as protective markings meant to keep sacred things safe from those who would misuse them. The copper was warm despite the morning chill, as if whatever lived inside was generating its own heat. The wax seal broke easily under gentle pressure, testament to Martha's understanding that this message was meant to be opened eventually. Inside, wrapped in oiled leather that had protected it from decades of moisture, Joseph found multiple items that made his breath catch in his throat. A hand-drawn map of the property showed the location of underground springs he'd never known existed. Legal documents dating back to the 1820s revealed that his family's connection to this land was more complex than he'd ever imagined. And at the bottom of the cylinder, wrapped in silk that still held the faint scent of Martha's favorite perfume, was a letter in her familiar handwriting. Thunder stirred beside him, lifting his great head with obvious effort to watch as Joseph unfolded the pages with shaking hands. The bull's breathing was shallow now, each inhalation a struggle, but his eyes remained focused on the letter with the intensity of someone waiting for the end of a story they'd helped to write. Martha's words, written in the careful script she'd maintained even as cancer ravaged her body, filled the pages with love, wisdom, and one final revelation that would change everything Joseph thought he knew about their life together. But as he began to read, Thunder's breathing suddenly became more labored, and Joseph realized that his faithful guardian was running out of time. The financial pressure that had seemed so overwhelming just hours earlier now felt insignificant compared to the impending loss of his dearest friend. Rick Blackwood's threats, the bank's demands, even the foreclosure notice that still sat on his kitchen table. None of it mattered as much as the dying bull who had carried Martha's love across the years like a sacred trust. Joseph set the letter aside and gathered Thunder's massive head in his arms, feeling the weight of devotion and sacrifice in every labored breath. Whatever Martha's final message contained, whatever secrets the cylinder revealed, they would have to wait. Right now, the most important thing in the world was ensuring that Thunder's final moments were filled with the same love and gratitude he'd shown throughout his remarkable life. Margaret Rose appeared with coffee as the sun cleared the mountains, her eyes red with unshed tears. "How's he doing?" she asked, though Thunder's condition was obvious to anyone with eyes to see. "He's waiting," Joseph replied, his voice hoarse with emotion, "just like he's been waiting for 3 years. But this time, he's waiting to go home to Martha." As if hearing his name mentioned, Thunder's eyes fluttered open one more time, focusing on Joseph's face with an expression of infinite tenderness. In that moment, Joseph understood that this magnificent creature had given him the greatest gift possible. He'd kept Martha's love alive through the darkest period of grief, and now he was ready to carry it forward into whatever came next. Thunder passed away as the first rays of sunlight touched the Cherokee oak tree, his final breath a gentle sigh that seemed to carry 3 years of faithful devotion into the morning air. Joseph felt the great bull's spirit leave his body like warmth departing from a cooling hearth, and for a moment the world seemed impossibly quiet, as if all of nature was observing a moment of silence for a guardian whose watch had finally ended. Margaret Rose wept openly, her small frame shaking with sobs as she stroked Thunder's still warm flank. "He waited," she whispered through her tears. "That sweet boy waited until you had Martha's message before he let himself go home to her." Joseph sat in stunned silence, one hand resting on Thunder's massive head, while the other clutched Martha's letter against his chest. The financial crisis that had consumed his thoughts for weeks now seemed like a distant concern compared to the immediate reality of loss. Thunder had been more than a companion animal. He'd been the living embodiment of Martha's love, her final gift stretched across 3 years of patient devotion. Dr. Sarah Mankiller arrived an hour later to officially confirm what they already knew, her Cherokee features etched with the same grief that marked Joseph's face. She'd delivered Thunder as a calf, had watched him grow from a gangly youngster into the magnificent bull who'd become legend in Cherokee County. "He lived with purpose," she said quietly, her veterinarian's clinical detachment unable to mask her personal sorrow. Not many creatures, human or animal, can claim that. The practicalities of Thunder's death demanded immediate attention despite Joseph's emotional state. A bull weighing 1,200 pounds couldn't simply be left beside the oak tree, no matter how appropriate that resting place might seem. Margaret Rose made the necessary phone calls while Joseph sat vigil, arranging for the specialized equipment needed to move Thunder's body with the dignity his life had earned. But it was Martha's letter that demanded Joseph's most urgent attention, its pages rustling in the October breeze like autumn leaves heavy with secrets. With shaking hands, he unfolded the careful script that had guided him through 30 years of marriage, her voice speaking to him from beyond death with the same gentle authority she'd exercised in life. "My dearest Joseph," the letter began, and he could hear her voice as clearly as if she were sitting beside him in their old porch swing. "If you're reading this, Thunder has fulfilled the most important mission of his life. I spent months training him during my treatments, teaching him to guard our oak tree and wait for the moment when you'd need guidance most. That sweet bull understood every word I said, Joe. Animals know things about love and loyalty that we forget in our human complications." Joseph's vision blurred as he continued reading, Martha's words painting a picture of preparation and foresight that humbled him with its depth. She'd known, somehow, that he would face a crisis that threatened everything they'd built together. The letter revealed planning that had begun during her first diagnosis, a systematic preparation for problems she wouldn't live to solve herself. "This land holds more secrets than you know," Martha's letter continued. "The Cherokee deed you'll find in the cylinder makes your family permanent caretakers, not owners, a distinction that matters more than you might imagine. But the real treasure isn't legal documents or property rights. It's the underground spring system that runs beneath our pastures, Joe. Clean water that could supply hundreds of families, worth more than gold to people who understand what really matters." The revelation struck Joseph like lightning. He looked across the familiar fields of his farm with new eyes, understanding suddenly that the occasional wet spots in the lower pasture, the places where grass grew greener and thicker, weren't just quirks of drainage, but signs of an underground river system that predated human settlement by millennia. Martha's letter provided a hand-drawn map, surprisingly detailed for someone who'd never claimed artistic talent, showing the locations where artesian springs bubbled up from deep aquifers. Notes in her careful handwriting explained that she'd spent her final year researching water rights and environmental law, understanding that clean water would become increasingly valuable as development pressured the mountain communities they loved. "I've hidden something else for you, my love," the letter continued. "In the cave system beneath the north pasture, there's a metal box containing $50,000 in gold coins. I saved that money over 20 years, selling my quilts and preserves at the farmer's market, never telling you because I wanted to surprise you someday. Consider it my final gift to the man who gave me the happiest 30 years any woman could ask for." Joseph's hands trembled as the full scope of Martha's preparations became clear. She hadn't just hidden a letter in the oak tree. She'd created an entire support system designed to activate when he needed it most. The gold coins would handle the immediate financial crisis, while the water rights would provide long-term security for the farm. But more than that, she'd given him a purpose that extended beyond their personal life together. The letter's final pages contained instructions for finding the hidden cave and detailed explanations of the legal documents Martha had researched and prepared. She'd consulted with Cherokee Nation attorneys, environmental lawyers, and water rights specialists, building a case that would protect the land from developers like Rick Blackwood while ensuring it continued serving the community that had supported their family for generations. "Don't think of this as my final goodbye," Martha's letter concluded. "Think of it as my way of staying involved in the work we started together. This farm was never just ours, Joe. We were its caretakers, responsible for passing it on to people who'd love it as much as we did. Thunder understood that responsibility. Now it's your turn to carry it forward." Margaret Rose had been reading over his shoulder, her tears dropping onto Martha's carefully preserved pages. That woman, she whispered, her voice filled with awe. She thought of everything, didn't she? Even from her hospital bed, she was still taking care of you. The sound of vehicles approaching interrupted their moment of revelation. Joseph looked up to see a convoy of trucks and SUVs turning into his driveway, led by Rick Blackwood's familiar black vehicle. But this time, the developer wasn't alone. He'd brought what appeared to be a small army of lawyers, surveyors, and official-looking people whose presence transformed Joseph's quiet farm into something resembling a crime scene. Rick emerged from his vehicle with a triumphant expression that made Joseph's blood run cold. In his hands he carried what appeared to be court documents, their legal seals glinting in the morning sunlight like badges of authority. "Mr. Whitehorse," Rick called out, his voice carrying across the property with smug confidence. "I'm afraid circumstances have changed. We've discovered that your property contains significant mineral and water rights that complicate the foreclosure process." The developer's strategy became clear as his team spread across the farm like an occupying force. They weren't just interested in buying the land anymore. They were claiming it contained resources that belonged to the state or federal government, resources that could be developed regardless of who held the surface rights. Joseph realized with growing horror that Rick had somehow learned about the underground springs, possibly through illegal surveillance or bribery of local officials. "You can't just take what isn't yours," Margaret Rose declared, stepping between Rick and Joseph with the fierce protectiveness of a mother defending her child. "This land has been in the Whitehorse family for 2 centuries. You've got no right to come in here with your fancy papers and steal it." Rick's smile never wavered, but something cold and predatory flickered behind his eyes. "Actually, Mrs. Chen, we have every right. When property contains resources vital to national security, and clean water certainly qualifies in today's environment, eminent domain laws allow for immediate acquisition. Mr. Whitehorse will be compensated fairly, of course, but the development of these resources serves the greater good." Joseph felt the world tilting beneath his feet as the scope of Rick's deception became clear. This had never been about building a resort or preserving Cherokee heritage. It was about water theft on a massive scale, using legal technicalities to steal resources that rightfully belonged to the community that had protected them for generations. Thunder's body lay still beside the oak tree. His faithful vigil ended just as the greatest threat to his territory materialized in the form of corporate greed disguised as public service. Joseph looked down at Martha's letter, her careful preparations suddenly seeming fragile against the overwhelming force of legal machinery and political corruption. But as Rick's team began setting up surveying equipment, Joseph remembered Martha's final words about responsibility and purpose. She'd prepared him for this moment, armed him with knowledge and resources that Rick couldn't have anticipated. The question now was whether Joseph had the courage to use them, whether an aging teacher and a heartbroken widow could stand against the combined forces of corporate power and legal manipulation. The battle for Willowbrook Farm was about to begin, and the outcome would determine not just Joseph's future, but the fate of the clean water that flowed beneath Cherokee County's mountains, sustaining life in ways that accountants and lawyers could never truly understand. The confrontation with Rick Blackwood's legal army might have ended differently if Sarah Walking Bear hadn't chosen that precise moment to arrive with 3 carloads of Cherokee Nation officials and a lawyer whose presence transformed the entire dynamic. Joseph watched from beside Thunder's still form as the elderly tribal elder emerged from her grandson's pickup truck, with the deliberate dignity of someone who'd survived 84 years by knowing exactly when to fight and when to wait. "Mr. Blackwood," Sarah called out, her voice carrying across the property with surprising strength, "I believe you're trespassing on Cherokee Nation treaty land without proper authorization." Rick's confident smile faltered as he recognized the implications of tribal sovereignty, but he quickly recovered, gesturing toward his legal documents with practiced arrogance. Mrs. Walkingbear, these federal warrants supersede any tribal claims. We're acting under eminent domain authority for national security purposes. The Cherokee lawyer, a sharp-featured woman named Jennifer Sequoia, stepped forward with her own briefcase full of documents. Actually, Mr. Blackwood, you're acting under fraudulent authority. We've been monitoring your activities for several weeks now, and your company has no legitimate federal backing for this operation. Joseph felt Martha's letter crackling in his jacket pocket as he watched the legal chess match unfold around Thunder's body. The irony wasn't lost on him. His faithful bull had died protecting secrets that were now being fought over by lawyers and corporate representatives who'd never spent a single night listening to the wind through Cherokee oak leaves or watching sunrise paint the mountains in shades of hope. Jennifer Sequoia's revelation sent visible shockwaves through Rick's team. She produced documents showing that Cherokee Valley Resort Corporation was a shell company funded by a consortium of fracking interests who'd been buying up mountain properties under false pretenses. The resort had always been a lie. The real plan involved extracting natural gas from shale deposits while stealing the underground water system to support industrial operations. The Cherokee Nation has been investigating this fraud for months, Jennifer continued, her voice steady despite the magnitude of her accusations. We have documentation proving that your company bribed local officials to obtain those warrants, violated environmental protection laws, and conspired to defraud property owners throughout Cherokee County. Rick's facade crumbled like a house built on shifting sand. The man who'd appeared so confident just moments earlier now looked like a cornered animal, his expensive suit and polished demeanor unable to mask the desperation in his eyes. "You can't prove any of that," he snarled, but his voice lacked conviction. Margaret Rose had been quietly reading Martha's letter over Joseph's shoulder, her sharp mind immediately grasping the implications of the water rights documentation. "Joe," she whispered urgently, "Martha knew. Somehow she knew this was coming and prepared for it." Joseph nodded, understanding finally that his wife's months of research hadn't been random curiosity about Cherokee history and environmental law. She'd somehow detected the early signs of the conspiracy that now threatened their community, and she'd spent her final year building legal defenses that would activate long after her death. Even dying, Martha had been 3 steps ahead of everyone else. The Cherokee Nation's intervention created breathing space, but Joseph knew the real battle would be fought in courtrooms and government offices far from the mountains he loved. Rick's backers had invested too much money and political capital to retreat easily, and they'd return with better lawyers and more sophisticated legal strategies. The question was whether Joseph could use Martha's preparations effectively enough to protect not just his own farm, but the entire water system that supported Cherokee County. Sarah Walkingbear approached him as the various legal teams retreated to their vehicles, her aged hand finding his shoulder with gentle pressure. "Your wife was a remarkable woman," she said quietly. "She came to me 6 months before she died, asking questions about Cherokee water rights and tribal sovereignty. I thought she was just interested in history, but now I understand she was preparing for war." The revelation that Martha had consulted with tribal elders during her final months added another layer to Joseph's understanding of her preparations. She hadn't just researched legal documents, she'd built relationships with people who understood the deeper significance of protecting sacred land and water. Martha had been creating alliances that would outlive her physical presence. Jennifer Sequoia remained after the others departed. Her legal expertise focused on the documents Martha had hidden in the oak tree. The Cherokee deed proved particularly significant. It established the Whitehorse family as permanent caretakers rather than owners, a distinction that carried both privileges and responsibilities under tribal law. More importantly, it meant that any attempt to seize the land through eminent domain would require Cherokee Nation consent, a barrier that Rick's fraudulent warrants couldn't overcome. "Your wife understood something that most people miss," Jennifer explained as they examined Martha's careful research. "Water rights in Cherokee territory are governed by different laws than regular property ownership. The underground springs you're sitting on aren't just valuable. They're sacred to our people, protected by treaties that predate the United States government." The financial implications began crystallizing as Margaret Rose helped Joseph understand Martha's hidden savings. The $50,000 in gold coins would handle the immediate foreclosure crisis, but the long-term value lay in the water rights themselves. Clean mountain spring water was becoming increasingly precious as development and climate change threatened traditional sources. Rather than being a burden, the farm could become a sustainable source of income that honored both Cherokee traditions and environmental responsibility. Thunder's death had left an enormous hole in Joseph's heart, but it had also freed him to act decisively in ways that caring for the ailing bull had prevented. Martha's letter included specific instructions for finding the hidden cave system, complete with hand-drawn maps that showed her own exploration of passages that honeycombed the limestone beneath their pastures. She'd spent hours underground during her final year, documenting water flow patterns and mineral content with the thoroughness of a trained scientist. The cave exploration would have to wait, though, because Rick's retreat was clearly tactical rather than strategic. Joseph could see vehicles parked on the ridgeline above his property, monitoring his movements and probably intercepting his communications. The battle for Willowbrook Farm had escalated into something resembling a siege, with corporate interests trying to starve him out, while legal challenges worked their way through various court systems. Margaret Rose proved invaluable during this tense period, her own experience with loss and survival providing practical wisdom that complemented Martha's strategic preparations. She organized a support network among Joseph's former students and Cherokee County neighbors, creating a communication system that could function even if Rick's people managed to cut phone lines or jam cell towers. The community that had rallied around Joseph during the financial crisis now transformed into something resembling a resistance movement. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on Joseph as he sat beside Thunder's grave, which they'd dug beneath the oak tree where the faithful bull had maintained his vigil. A retired elementary school teacher was now at the center of a conflict involving corporate fraud, environmental protection, and Native American sovereignty, issues that would have seemed impossibly complex just weeks earlier. But Martha's careful preparations had given him tools and allies he never could have imagined, transforming him from a victim of circumstances into an active participant in his own destiny. The hidden gold was exactly where Martha's map indicated, buried in a metal box within the cave system that had protected Cherokee families during countless historical upheavals. Joseph's hands shook as he counted the coins by flashlight, each piece representing hours of patient work at farmers' markets and craft fairs. Martha had been building their salvation one quilt and one jar of preserves at a time, never telling him about the growing treasure that would someday preserve everything they'd built together. But the real treasure was the knowledge Martha had accumulated about the underground water system and the legal framework protecting it. Her notes revealed a woman who'd transformed herself from a farm wife into an amateur hydrogeologist and legal researcher, driven by love for the land and foresight about the battles that would come. Joseph realized that Thunder's faithful vigil had been protecting more than just a letter. It had been guarding the accumulated wisdom that would allow their community to survive corporate predation. As night fell over Cherokee County, Joseph sat on his porch with Margaret Rose, Thunder's collar resting across his lap like a talisman. The immediate financial crisis was solved, but the larger battle for the farm's future was just beginning. Rick Blackwood's backers wouldn't surrender easily, and they had resources that dwarfed anything a retired teacher and his neighbors could muster. But Joseph also had something Rick's corporate masters would never understand: the accumulated love and loyalty of a community that had been built over generations of mutual support. Thunder's death had taught him that some things were worth dying for, and Martha's preparations had shown him that love could reach across death itself to protect what mattered most. The question now was whether that would be enough to save the mountains they all called home. The courtroom in Asheville felt like a cathedral of justice as Joseph Whitehorse walked through its heavy oak doors. Martha's letter folded carefully in his breast pocket, and Thunder's collar wrapped around his wrist like a bracelet of remembrance. 3 months had passed since his faithful Bulge's death. 3 months of legal battles that had transformed a simple foreclosure case into a landmark dispute over water rights, corporate fraud, and the sacred responsibility of caring for the land that sustains life itself. Jennifer Sequoia, the Cherokee Nation attorney who'd become Joseph's legal guardian angel, squeezed his shoulder as they took their seats at the plaintiff's table. Across the aisle, Rick Blackwood sat with a team of corporate lawyers whose expensive suits couldn't mask the desperation in their eyes. The fraud investigation had unraveled their carefully constructed web of shell companies and bribed officials, but they were fighting to the bitter end, hoping to salvage something from their failed scheme. Judge Patricia Morrison, a no-nonsense woman in her 60s who'd grown up in these mountains, called the court to order with the gravity of someone who understood the implications of her decision. This wasn't just about one farm or one elderly teacher. It was about whether communities could protect their natural resources from corporate predators who viewed water and land as commodities to be exploited rather than treasures to be preserved. The Cherokee Nation's case was built on the foundation Martha had constructed during her final year, her meticulous research providing the legal framework that made their victory possible. The original 1823 deed establishing the Whitehorse family as caretakers rather than owners had been the key, creating a legal relationship that predated modern property law and couldn't be dissolved through ordinary foreclosure proceedings. But it was Martha's documentation of the underground spring system that truly devastated Rick's defense. Her hand-drawn maps, water quality analyses, and environmental impact assessments revealed planning and foresight that put professional geological surveys to shame. She'd understood instinctively that clean water would become the most valuable resource of the 21st century, and she'd positioned her family to be its protectors rather than its exploiters. Joseph testified about Thunder's role in preserving Martha's message, his voice breaking as he described the bull's faithful vigil and final sacrifice. The courtroom fell silent as he read portions of Martha's letter, her words reaching across death to touch hearts that had been hardened by years of legal cynicism. Judge Morrison wiped her eyes openly as Joseph concluded with Martha's final instructions about love, responsibility, and the sacred duty to protect what cannot be replaced. The verdict, when it came, was swift and decisive. Judge Morrison ruled that the Cherokee Nation held superior water rights under federal treaty law, that the foreclosure proceedings were invalid due to the property's unique legal status, and that Rick Blackwood's company would face criminal prosecution for fraud and conspiracy. More importantly, she established a precedent that would protect other mountain communities from similar schemes. Margaret Rose was waiting on the courthouse steps when Joseph emerged, her face radiant with triumph and relief. "Martha would be so proud," she whispered as they embraced, both of them crying openly as the weight of victory settled over them like a blessing. "She saved not just your farm, but every drop of clean water in Cherokee County." The financial settlement was more generous than Joseph had dared hope. Rick's backers, desperate to avoid criminal prosecution, agreed to pay substantial damages that would fund water conservation projects throughout the region. The Cherokee Nation established a trust to protect the underground springs, with Joseph serving as the primary caretaker and Margaret Rose as his assistant. At 72, Joseph had found a new purpose that honored both his teaching background and his wife's environmental vision. Thunder's grave beneath the oak tree became a place of pilgrimage for people throughout the mountains. Visitors who came to pay respects to the bull whose faithful vigil had saved their community's water supply. Joseph installed a bronze plaque that read simply, "Thunder, guardian of sacred waters, keeper of sacred trust." Children from his former classes brought flowers and small stones, understanding somehow that this place represented something larger than one animal's devotion. The spring system that Martha had discovered and documented became the centerpiece of a sustainable water cooperative that served 3 counties. Joseph found himself traveling throughout Appalachia, sharing Martha's research and helping other communities protect their natural resources from corporate exploitation. His teacher's skills proved invaluable in explaining complex environmental issues to people who instinctively understood the importance of clean water but lacked the technical knowledge to defend it legally. Margaret Rose proved to be an ideal partner in this new venture, her sharp business instincts complementing Joseph's educational background. Together they created a model of community-based resource management that attracted attention from environmental groups nationwide. The farm that had nearly been lost to foreclosure became a demonstration site for sustainable water use and ecological agriculture. Sarah Walking Bear, now 85 and officially recognized as a Cherokee Nation elder, blessed the water cooperative during a ceremony that drew hundreds of participants. Her words echoed across the valley as she spoke about the connection between human communities and the natural world that sustains them. Water remembers everything it touches. The water that flows from these springs carries the prayers of our ancestors and the hopes of our children. Joseph and Martha Whitehorse understood this sacred relationship. Thunder understood it. Now it's our responsibility to carry this understanding forward. The anniversary of Thunder's death became an annual celebration of community resilience and environmental stewardship. Joseph would stand beside the bull's grave, reading from Martha's letter to audiences that included former students, Cherokee tribal members, and environmental activists from across the region. The story of a faithful bull, a dying woman's foresight, and an elderly teacher's courage had become legend, inspiring similar protection efforts throughout rural America. Joseph's relationship with the land had deepened in ways he never could have imagined during his teaching career. He understood now that Martha's final lesson had been about stewardship itself, the recognition that we are temporary caretakers of resources that belong to future generations. Thunder had embodied this principle, sacrificing his own comfort and ultimately his life to protect something larger than himself. The farmhouse that had once echoed with loneliness now bustled with activity as Joseph and Margaret Rose hosted visitors, researchers, and policymakers who came to study their water conservation model. The porch where Joseph had once sat alone, grieving for Martha and facing financial ruin, became a gathering place for people who shared his commitment to protecting the natural world for their grandchildren. As winter approached, Joseph often found himself at Thunder's grave in the early morning hours, when frost outlined every blade of grass and the underground springs sent wisps of steam into the cold air. In those quiet moments, he could feel the presence of both Martha and Thunder, their love transformed into something larger than personal affection, a commitment to nurturing life itself in all its forms. The copper cylinder that had held Martha's message now rested in a place of honor in the farmhouse, but its contents had been copied and distributed to communities throughout Appalachia. Martha's research methods and legal strategies had become a template for grassroots environmental protection, her love for one farm expanding into a movement that touched thousands of lives. Joseph understood finally that happiness wasn't the absence of loss or struggle, but the knowledge that love could transcend death itself, that purpose could be found at any age, and that the connections we build with family, whether human or animal, create legacies that outlive our physical presence. Martha's love lived on in clean water flowing from mountain springs. Thunder's devotion lived on in the children who left flowers at his grave. And Joseph's teaching continued in every person who learned that some things are worth protecting regardless of the personal cost. Standing beneath the ancient oak tree where this journey had begun, Joseph felt the deep contentment of a man who discovered that the greatest treasures can't be bought or sold, only earned through love, preserved through sacrifice, and shared through the simple act of caring for something larger than ourselves. The farm would endure, the water would flow clean and clear, and the story of Thunder's faithful vigil would inspire future generations to choose love over fear, stewardship over exploitation, and hope over despair. Message for American seniors, 200 words. At 72, Joseph thought his purpose ended with retirement and his wife's death. But sometimes, our most meaningful chapters begin when we think the story's over. Like so many of us who've buried spouses and faced financial pressures, Joseph discovered that love doesn't end with death. It transforms into something even more powerful. His wife, Martha, spent her final years secretly preparing solutions to problems she wouldn't live to solve, proving that love always finds a way to reach across time and protect what matters most. Thunder, their faithful bull, showed us that loyalty and devotion can move mountains, or at least save them from corporate greed. This story reminds us that our wisdom, accumulated over decades of living, is exactly what our communities need to face modern challenges. Whether it's protecting the environment, fighting corporate exploitation, or simply being the neighbor who notices when someone needs help, our years have prepared us for battles we never expected to fight. The relationships we build, with people, animals, and the land itself, create legacies that ripple forward through generations. Your story isn't over. Your most important chapter might just be beginning. Questions for engagement. Have you ever had an animal companion who seemed to understand you better than most people? What did they teach you about loyalty and love? What resources in your community, clean water, open spaces, family farms, deserve protection for future generations? How can we become better stewards of what we've inherited? Please share your thoughts and experiences in the comments below.